Good afternoon. I'm Brittany Johnson, and thank you for joining us for an ABC4 News Special Town Hall. America in Pain, a positive path forward. Now, over the next hour, we're going to have a conversation about affecting real change. Now, we want to have a meaningful dialogue discussing actionable steps Utahns can take that will lead to long-term solutions. So joining us today for this important discussion, we have Dr. Matt Harris, United States Marshal for the District of Utah and former criminal justice and public policy professor, Pastor Corey Hodges, lead pastor of the Point Church in Salt Lake City, and Kenny Akers, a military veteran who says he stands for peace and justice. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, let's get right into this with our first question today. Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice. Unfortunately, this is not the first time a Black American has been killed in a racially charged incident. But why has this particular tragedy, George Floyd, struck such a chord? We'll start with you, Pastor Corey.
Thank you, Brittany, and good afternoon. I think the confluence of several events over the past 30 days have probably brought some of the frustration to the surface. I think with the videotape that we saw of the young man jogging in Georgia, Aubrey, I believe his name was. I think the Central Park Karen who called the police and alleged that she was going to call the police on this African-American bird watcher. And then the horrific explicit tape of Floyd being murdered in the streets. And I think those three events brought together kind of triggered the reaction that we're seeing all over the country. It's difficult to look at that video. And I think the video in and of itself, watching someone die, take their last breath, is probably what triggered such a reaction.
All right, Kenny, your take on this.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you as well, Pastor. Thanks for that. I want to come from a position of love in regards to this. We do have a lot of events that are happening time and again. And I feel culturally what's happening amongst us is that we are reaching out with our hearts, we are reaching out with our souls, and we are trying to voice out what's happening in the positions that's happening right now, the overextension of police brutality and the mistreatment of certain individuals. We're trying to outreach and reach out to the citizens in regards to this. It's impacted because we all feel this pain, and this should be everybody's responsibility at this point.
And Dr. Matt Harris, we'll go to you for the answer as well.
Sure. Let me talk about the unfortunate positive that had happened from this. And I hate to say that, but law enforcement, for the first time in my memory, unanimously went out and said, this is wrong, this is callous, this is against our training. The Attorney General opened a civil rights investigation as well. 18,000 police departments nationwide condemn this action. You have police officers all over this nation who have condemned that. And that's a positive step, first step, for this callous nature of Mr. Floyd's death. I think the reason why it's become such a big story, obviously, as the other two gentlemen on the panel had mentioned, is also because it's just very callous. You see the officer, you see him on the knee on the neck, and it's against all law enforcement training that we're trained in the academy, and I've been doing this for 25 years.
And this is a tough topic and a tough discussion for a lot of people to have. So how do we have meaningful conversations about race and racism? We'll start with you, Dr. Matt Harris.
It's tough. This is a tough conversation. But like anything else in life, it's trust, it's compassion, it's understanding. We all have to understand that we all have our implicit bias. You start every conversation understanding that I'm biased. Everybody's biased based upon their own experiences, based upon what they're raised, based upon their relationships. And that's where it starts. And we have to realize that we will not always agree on the remedy, we will not always agree on the cause, but people need to be validated. They need their voices to be heard. They need understanding. And we need to have more compassion. And we can't force people not to have opinions that they don't have. We have to teach each individual, one person at a time, one officer at a time, one member of the public at a time, and try to come to a common place and have an open dialogue about it.
Okay, Kenny, I want to go to you for that question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the open dialogue, just for the simple fact that friendships and relationships happen every day. I mean, we do this normally. I mentioned this a little while back. I think we're complicating this more than we actually should be. We should be looking at each other with our heart. We should be friendly with each other, and we shouldn't be crossing certain boundaries that we shouldn't be crossing. And we all know what they are and what we shouldn't be doing, and we should just be kind to each other and just step forward with our best foot forward and just love each other.
Okay. And Pastor Hodges, lead pastor of the Point Church, a multicultural church, how do we have these meaningful conversations again about race and racism?
Yeah, I think it's two things. One, I agree with Kenny. It's relationships. That is very important, and you have to be intentional. Intentionality is a word that I've been using as we've been having these I've been having these conversations in the last few weeks. Intentionality. You have to create friends that are not like you, that don't look like you, that don't think like you, they weren't raised like you, and you have to go out of your way to create these relationships, because our human nature wants us to gravitate to people who are like ourselves. And so we have to be intentional about creating authentic relationships where conversations can be had. Now, the other thing is empathy. And it's tough for you to have empathy for someone if you cannot see their perspective. And you're not going to be able to see another perspective if you don't have an authentic relationship that is undergirding that empathy, the ability to feel someone else's pain. And if you don't know someone else's story, if you can't relate to someone else's pain, then you cannot be empathetic. So I think those are two very important things that we must have as part of this conversation: the ability to be intentional about our relationship circles, so that we can, through our conversations and our education about our differences and our similarities, be able to exhibit and express empathy for our brothers and sisters.
Now, we have some extra time here, so before we head to our break, I do want to follow up with you, Pastor Corey, and just ask, is it that simple? Where do people start that are just looking for a place to say, how do I start having this conversation?
Yeah. Well, for me, as a person of faith, I think I follow the principles of the Bible. I was introduced to the Bible and to God and Christ through my parents, but everybody may not have that path. That's how I started understanding the words that Jesus taught, to love our fellow man. But I think even if you're not a person of faith, you can be a person of goodwill that just have respect, and you have love and concern for our fellow man. We're all human, and despite all of our differences, there are things that we have in common that we can unite around. A lot of us are parents. We love our kids. A lot of us love our country. There are things that we can talk about that we have in common that can give us a greater ability to develop those relationships. So start with, what do you have in common? Get to know somebody. What can we talk about that we have in common? That's a starting spot in my mind.
All right, everyone, we are just getting started here. So much more coming up within our hour here. Still ahead, how can police departments and communities build better relationships? Our panel weighs in after the break. Police departments like the one here in Salt Lake City and communities do to build better relationships with each other. We'll start with you, Pastor Corey, for this question.
Thanks. I think one of the things that police officers and the police department can do in general is develop relationship with community leaders like myself and many others that are in the community that they may be policing, so that they can understand the culture of the town or the city or the neighborhood that they're policing. It's going to be difficult for a police officer, for instance, to understand the culture in the neighborhood that's different than maybe one they grew up in. So I think if that's the case, I think there has to be some effort to make sure that there's some engagement with the officer, with the department, and those community leaders. And the community has a job as well. So it's not just one-sided, it's two-sided. The community leaders and the officers have to work together so that policing can be seen in a more positive light.
Okay. And Kenny, you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Pastor spoke about building the relationships. We're seeing a lot of that right now. I mean, once these incidences, once they start happening, people seem to gravitate to it even more. And we need to do this all the time. This should be something normal in our community that we do all the time. Building those relationships, saying hey to each other, just understanding the culture, just like Pastor said there. I mean, there's a whole diversity there that we all should understand with each other. And we just got to take a couple of steps forward and just understand who we are in the community and have those relationships.
And I do want to follow up with you, Kenny, on that. We see law enforcement officers and protesters coming together, exchanging dialogue, passionate dialogue, right. Taking a knee with each other, holding hands. How far does that go for these long-term solutions people are trying to get?
In the moment, it's mentorship. Right there, the community is starting to see the police in a positive way and vice versa. And that relationship and that bond is built right then and there. And if the message is conveyed to law enforcement, if they're trying to build long-lasting relationships with their community, they should be making those moments every day and as much as they possibly can. And of course the community as well, and seeing what they can do for the law enforcement to help out as well.
All right, and Dr. Matt Harris, I do want you to answer this question as well. I'll repeat it. What can the police officers do and the community do to come together and build better relationships?
Sure. Our children and our families' first interaction with law enforcement needs to be positive. It needs to be a positive interaction. And that needs to start from day one. That needs to start with children. That needs to start with law enforcement being members of the community, getting involved, teaching, coaching, building relationships with community leaders. There's a lot that's going on nationally in the last few years. Coffee with a cop. You've seen that. The 9 p.m. routine. There's things that law enforcement has done for the last few years and is continuing to do to try to build better relationships with minority communities, and it's really, really important. As I said, the relationships are important, but that first interaction has to be positive. And law enforcement officers go into this profession to do good. And we have to remember that. And we have to remember that the cops are the good guys. The cops aren't the bad guys. They're there to help. No other profession are you expected to be a counselor, somebody who breaks up a domestic violence incident, somebody who's looking for a lost child. It's a very, very diverse profession. It's not just about the gun. It's not just about the badge. It's about building relationships with your community. It's about investing in your community. It's about sometimes having those officers live in those communities which they serve. And situations like this have a detrimental effect, unfortunately, on the negative side, on law enforcement. My wife told me this weekend she had to have a conversation with my child about cops being the bad guys. And how does she feel about that narrative that's kind of going on right now? So we need to change that. And there's an emotional toll. And you have to think about, some of the protests that went awry in those officers, their spouses and their children, sending them to work that day, and wondering if they're going to come home, wondering if they're going to be one of the 750 officers that were assaulted over the course of the last couple of weeks. And that's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate that that anarchists and gangs hijacked a very peaceful protest.
All right, definitely heavy emotions on both sides there of the aisle. The conversation continues. Still ahead, putting words into action. Actionable steps law enforcement and activists can take to affect real long-term change. Law enforcement and activists can take to affect real change. And for this, we do want to start with Pastor Corey Hodges.
I think some of the videos, Brittany, that we've seen across the country of law enforcement officers joining in the protest as opposed to having negative interactions in those times, in my opinion, I've seen that has changed the whole atmosphere during the activism and during the protests. I do think protesting should be peaceful. It should not be destructive. It should not be the destruction of property. I think that distracts from the conversation when that happens. I also want to say that, understanding the idea that, you know, everybody wants to get home safely, I think that's a great point. And I feel that way about police officers, the pressure and the idea of wanting to make it home safe. And that same feeling is we have in the minority community. Mothers and fathers wanting their children to get home safe. An officer that works, they're blue from on their shift, but a minority is in their skin all the time. And so there is no break from being black or being brown. And so I think that's why when we see activism, when we see protests, it's important that those relationships are strong and that they understand the concerns on both sides and maybe be more of a uniting force with activists and protesters where they can be seen as team members for a common purpose, a common cause. I think that will probably go a long way.
Okay, and Dr. Matt Harris, I want you to weigh in on this question as well.
Sure. This is Leadership 101. You know, what type of culture are you fostering? And law enforcement leaders need to foster a positive culture. They can't accept crass jokes. They can't accept or tolerate poor behavior. People who commit misconduct must be punished and penalized and removed from the profession. And that's a small amount of people. It's a very small amount of people. But it's leadership. It's about the culture that you build and that you foster as a law enforcement leader. And you've heard this before, it's tone at the top. And that's really, really important. And you know, moving forward, you see additional training and additional bias training and de-escalation training. And those are things that law enforcement has continued to do and has gotten better over the years. We're not there yet, obviously, but in my 25 years in law enforcement, we are so much better than we were on these issues years ago. It may not seem that way, but we see a lot of anti-bias training, and we see a lot of de-escalation training, and we even have the use of less than lethal weapons, which 25 years ago they weren't available.
Okay, and we've heard the expression, real change starts from within, and that's change that, Kenny, you actually were out there. It was caught on video. People were trying to dilute the message of protesters that they were sending out and trying to loot the 7-Eleven, and you stood up and you stopped them and you started a conversation here. When we talk about change, how can one person step up and affect change?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I'm a patriot. I took an oath swearing to the country as a military member to defend this country against foreign and domestic problems. Right now, me personally, I feel like there's a domestic problem when people are committing violence and when they are diluting the message, as you had said earlier. We can't necessarily do the damages and ruin the message because right now we're trying to fix a problem. And for myself, if I could stand up and make that individual change, just imagine if we all come together and make that change.
All right, gentlemen, I do want to thank you all for being part of this panel discussion. Thank you so much for your time and the work that you guys are doing in our community.
Absolutely.
All right, still ahead, Salt Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall joins the show. We talk about what can be done in addition to protesting to get the attention of Utah lawmakers. Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall has thrown her support behind the George Floyd movement. She even participated in a die-in to protest the deaths of African Americans at the hands of police. Now, I spoke with her today about what she's doing as mayor to create change.
I'm listening. I know that cities throughout the nation right now are looking at how to unpack the implicit bias that exists in so many of the policies that cities have control over. And Salt Lake City wants to do this work. Not only me, but I think we've heard the city council say we're ready for this. And I think that there's never been such a political mandate in my lifetime for elected people to be listening and taking serious action to make things better for all of our residents.
And what are you doing as Salt Lake City's mayor to address racial injustices and bring about change?
So just a couple of months ago, I asked the council for funding for the city to do a citywide equity master plan. It's something we've never done before, but I ran for mayor wanting to bring greater equity. And I know that this is something cities around the country are doing. It helps a city examine from a third party looking in to say, How are we doing our hiring practices? What do we consider a successful candidate? What kind of public engagement are we doing with all parts of our community? What barriers are there that we haven't intentionally put in place but are keeping residents from engaging? What kind of barriers are there that are keeping businesses from accessing the support that the city can offer? And unpacking and then creating a plan so that we know how to do all of the things we do with greater equity.
Perfect. And that leads us into our next question here. For people looking for ways to help, where do they even start?
I think it starts with listening, acknowledging, and becoming an ally. And that can mean different things for everyone across the state. But those are the critical pieces, I think. Showing up to protest is a great thing, and we support people's right to peacefully protest in Salt Lake City. But there's so many other ways also, from financial support for organizations, showing up for Black-owned businesses in the state, in Salt Lake City, and supporting with your dollars. But voting is critical.
And many demonstrators are calling for specific changes, including making it mandatory for police officers to wear body cameras, reducing funding for police forces, or encouraging people to vote, as you just did. Will these protests lead to lasting change?
I absolutely believe that they will. I think you're already starting to see that across the country as other cities and city councils are finalizing their budgets and making adjustments. It doesn't necessarily mean a defunding of police in every city. It can mean new types of training, more community-oriented policing, building relationships of trust, civilian review boards, which Salt Lake City has one, but some cities now are finally looking at putting those in place.
And last question, where do we go from here?
Well, we strike while the iron's hot. And this mandate of change is something that I hope and I encourage everyone who is having their voices heard today to stay engaged in the conversation. We know that won't necessarily happen, but this is an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for every single one of us as Americans. And where we go from here is a commitment in our hearts and our minds to the long-term work, the long-term engagement, and the insistence on equity. And it will not happen with a single vote at a single city council meeting. If there were an easy button, we would have pushed it a long time ago. But this is going to take a consistent effort from all of us.
All right, thank you so much, Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall, for your time. Truly appreciate you joining us for this panel discussion.
You'll be hearing from Tim Drisdom, Athletic Director at Intermountain Christian School and Worship Leader at the Point Church, Betty Sawyer, President of the NAACP Ogden Branch and founder of the Utah Black Roundtable, and Dr. Richard Ferguson, Medical Director at Steward Health Choice Utah. And Dr. Ferguson also serves on multiple subcommittees as part of Salt Lake County Mayor Jenny Wilson's Council for Diversity Affairs. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Dr. Ferguson, we're going to start with you. When I met you last week, when I first met you, you said something that really stood out to me. You said, to effect change, we don't need to start over. You said Black and brown people with many advanced degrees have already written legislation to address these topics, and the legislation just needs the support of white allies for long-term change. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I can. So particularly what I was getting at is this is not a new issue for many of us, particularly those of us that have been at the hand of police brutality in the past or feeling the effects of generations of systemic racism. And the thing is, ever since, or even before civil rights era, there have been initiatives put forth, even legislation that has been pushed towards not only national level but also the federal level to try and get more equality with housing, education, and just creating more opportunities to level the playing field for people of color. And some of these organizations right now that I feel have already done a lot of the ground and base work, you can look them up, particularly Policy Link. So it's a institute, think tank, Center for Social and Racial Policy Reform. The Philanthropic Racial Equality Initiative, that's an organization that has done a lot of the work where all you have to do is look at their website. They have already giving guidance on how you can get this policy to your local city council, county, or at the state level, and also trying to call and advocate for change with your particular congressman or local federal representatives.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ferguson, for that. The NAACP gathered at the Utah State Capitol to announce more change in regards to police reform. Now, the Salt Lake branch introduced legislation to address limiting the use of force, eliminating racial profiling, demilitarizing law enforcement, tracking and reporting data, as well as proper screening, educating, and training of all officers. Now, I want to bring you in for this, Betty Sawyer. How are these specific issues going to change the narrative and interactions between law enforcement and the community?
First of all, it's important that law enforcement understand what these issues are. It's not just understanding, because they have been on the agenda of not only the NAACP, the Urban League, many advocacy groups, and more recently the Black Lives Matter movement. And so in order to bring about work toward addressing those issues, you first have to identify the ones that are most pressing. And the NAACP has identified these as the most pressing, but along with that, Campaign Zero has added a few more, the 8 that can't wait. And those are issues that we can start, that don't cost a lot of money, and that even on a local level, police departments can start instituting those changes. I think having something on a state level is critical so that we can bring about some uniformity and guidance across all law enforcement agencies. And it's important that we begin somewhere. This is a starting point, but like many have said, it's not a one and done. So we have to have a starting point. There has to be a plan and strategy, and then there has to be accountability and transparency as we move this agenda forward.
All right, moving on to our next question here. Tim, earlier we talked about change and how it starts from within and from one person. Now, with you being involved heavily with Utah's youth, what conversations have you been having with them since the death of George Floyd, and as to how they can bring about the change and be the change?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me as well, Brittany. I have the opportunity to serve at Intermountain Christian School as an athletic director. And so I work with many athletes, and our school's in Cottonwood Heights, good old Cottonwood Heights, Utah. And I have a chance to interface with a lot of kids, a lot of youth that don't look like me, that don't share the same experiences as I do. What I have learned, even being a child myself and dealing with some issues that maybe my parents had to deal with, what I've learned is that the youth are resilient. And the youth of today kind of have at their disposal, they have access to culture. You know, as our world has progressed, and, you know, social media and all of these things, they have the access to get some of the information that in some situations, unfortunately, is kept from them. And so to encourage them to educate themselves, to watch movies, to those type of things that expose you to a different narrative, and then to speak truth to power in a respectful way, obviously. But that would be the thing that I feel like, you know, would drive them most, you know, to success for years to come.
All right, the conversation just getting started here with our second set of panelists, but still ahead, we shift the conversation to hope. With history often repeating itself, how can people hold out hope that things will change for the better? A message from the Dristham family after the break. Walter Scott, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Stephon Clark, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, and that's not even a quarter of the victims. We talk about hope and change, and when is it coming? So Tim, you and your brothers made a song called Hold On, and we'll watch some of that music video in just a second here. But before we do, why did you all decide to write this song at this time and title it Hold On?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the song was written during the actual more of a personal time for me, where I dealt with some direct racism, and so the song was kind of written in that particular time, and it resurfaced with just the opportunity that I've had with my brother, who's been home from playing basketball overseas because of, you know, the coronavirus. But we wrote this song and we released the song in this time because it was extremely fitting. And Hold On, you know, obviously it's the title of the song.
Weird stuff?
You know, we've been talking about change and
All right, so I know you guys are going to be on Good Things Utah on Thursday, but right now we want to get a sneak peek, and as we head to break, we want to listen to this song.
What have we come to? Where is the love? We need direction from God above. Just wanna quit, throw in the towel. What is the use in going the extra mile? Yeah, this one is for that lady sitting home alone, contemplating life if she should live it or be gone. This one is for that boy who think he getting grown. He make his own decisions cause he ran away from home. This one is for that mama crying on the phone, trying to mend relations cause addiction had her soul. It's a long road to get where we belong, but the journey makes us strong and trouble never lasts too long. It's what we come to. Yeah, I've been looking for the love. The devil trying to hold me up. I got my foot up on his neck while I look to God above. I know that in this battle I've already won. In these times of great despair, look to the one and casual.
If we want to keep the momentum going, I think it's time that we try to do three things. Listen. So for many of our white allies out there that are uncomfortable discussing the subject of race, is try to discuss, or at least ask at this time, what is it that you feel uncomfortable to anyone that is brown, black, or of color that you know? And then listen to their response and take it seriously. And then lastly, I would say, let's try to now give. So listen, learn, and then give to organizations, Black Lives Matter, support black businesses, to show that this is meaningful, you're taking it seriously, and we don't need to wait for another unnecessary death to occur. And try to, if you want to do something locally, I think the first small step is maybe addressing qualified immunity amongst the police force. That's something that's nationwide, and needing to hold our police more accountable for their actions, and more transparency with local oversight. So that's something that I think many people that are not black and brown, that want to figure out a way to move forward can do.
Okay, and Betty Sawyer, we'll go to you as well.
Yes, along with that, I think it's important now that we realize that there are real issues in our community. I think it's important on an individual level that we reflect and acknowledge where we are, where some of those concerns come from, and then commit to getting involved, commit to doing the work. And it's long-term work. It's not here and today and gone tomorrow. We didn't get here overnight, and we won't resolve these issues overnight. But there are many organizations, along with the NAACP, along with the Utah Black Roundtable, Black Lives Matter, and the list goes on and on, even our public institutions in education and health, that there are many disparities there that could use all of us working together to address those concerns. So once we've decided a best place for us, a good fit, then we just need to reach out and get involved. And again, that involvement needs to be long-term, not just today. And with the Black Roundtable and the NAACP, they have an agenda that's already laid out. So you can look at that and say, oh, I want to work on education. I want to work on police reform. I want to work on healthcare disparities. I want to work with youth. I want to work in juvenile or criminal justice. And so then do that work. And then get out and meet people, build relationships. I heard someone say that earlier. One of the ways to bring about change is to be around and engage and build relationships with people that don't necessarily look like yourself. And with our Juneteenth, that's something else that I do. Our upcoming Freedom and Heritage Festival, we have many activities that people can listen to, get involved in, and become more engaged.
Hey, Tim, I want to hear your thoughts, but we do need to head to break, so I'll hear those in just a few minutes here. All right, you guys, still ahead. We've heard people asking, when will things go back to normal? But will we ever? Or is a new normal being created? Our panel weighs in after the break. Cusp of a historic moment, and what comes next, Tim?
Yeah, I think not only are we on the cusp of a historic moment, I think we're in a historic moment, if I can say that. And the reason I believe that is because people are actually not just talking, but people are listening and people are doing. And it's not just people of color. We are getting a ton of support from places that we typically don't. And so I feel like we definitely are on the cusp of something really special.
Okay, so everyone touched on this next question in our last block. So I want to ask you guys this. Any last words that you really want to leave with our audience that you want to hit home with and resonate with them? We'll start with Dr. Ferguson for this.
I would say the biggest thing I would advocate is you can do something to make a change. You don't have to have fear that you can't make a difference. No matter what color you are, you're in the U.S., you can do a lot to reach upon, you have a voice, you can vote, but more so you can speak to your local representatives, local city council, local government to affect change. If you don't like what you see, do it either at the ballot box or when you go to advocate for particular legislation. So don't think that you are powerless or you have to wait for someone else to do something. Standing by at the wayside right now is not the time to do that. It's time to actually take action.
Okay, and Tim, we'll go to you.
Yeah, and it's hard not to reference kind of back to the song, but you know, as the changes are happening and things are moving a little slower than some might want, in the meantime, hold on to hope. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith in humankind. Don't lose faith in Christ or whatever religious system that you've ascribed to. But at the end of the day, like, we have to continue to remain positive through this time.
Okay, and Betty, I'd like to leave you with the last word here.
There's an African proverb that I subscribe to. It says, "I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am." And it points to the interconnectedness of all of us. And so what you do does affect me. What I do affects you. So it's important that we work together on these issues, that we acknowledge our humanity. And as Tim stated about hope, the theme for our Juneteenth festival this year is United in Hope. If I didn't have hope, if we didn't have hope, we could all give up today and go home and let things stay the way they are. But we know this is not our best self. This is not the best that we can be. This is not the best that Utah can be, nor our country. So it's important that we start where we are to commit to making change and being a part of that positive change.
All right, thank you all so much for being with us. And to everyone at home, ABC4 News is committed to keeping this conversation going. Now, to join in on the discussion, America in Pain, a positive path forward, email me, bjohnson@abc4.com, and you can find out more about the panelists we had on the show today by going to abc4.com. The News at 4 is next.